true story, which takes place at the early 17th century. The first telescopes were just invented, and in particular, Galileo had some of the best telescopes, and he was making a lot of discoveries. And one of them was actually the rings of Saturn. His telescope wasn't that good. He wasn't sure if it's rings or maybe just two moons. He thought that maybe it's really just two moons. But the thing is that at that point in time, they were making discoveries so fast that they didn't really have the proper time to publish papers. It was a real problem. So what Galileo decided to do when he has observed Saturn free-formed, he decided to send his fellows a commitment to this discovery rather than writing the formal full paper. But at that time there was still no El Gamal, no RSA. He had to improvise something, so he did the following. He used a simple commitment scheme. He chose a random permutation, and he permuted his discovery to the following anagram. I formed the three-nose verb suvara. Okay, so he took this anagram and he sends it over to his fellow physicists and colleagues, and something quite interesting happened. Kepler, that received this anagram, told him, "Well, I also had a discovery today." And he sent an anagram of his own. I'm an ubersoft 3D horsed verb. Okay, so they sent their commitments, and the day came for Galileo to decommit to its discovery, and he opened the commitment by sending the inverse permutation. And to his astonishment, what happened next is that Kepler revealed his own inverse permutation to the exact same discovery. Okay, this is quite a conundrum. So, how do we explain this? So, of course, what Kepler said is, this is concurrent and independent work, right? But Galileo didn't quite accept this, and he claimed that Kepler didn't quite know what he was committing to when he committed, right? So the explanation that he suggested is that he just chose some random permutation of its own, permuted whatever Galileo sent, and then later, once he saw what is the inverse permutation, he knew how to create his own inverse permutation. And this problem is actually quite challenging. It's a challenge that comes up quite a lot in cryptography, which is how can we demonstrate knowledge without revealing it? So could we actually ask Kepler at the time to demonstrate that he knows what he really commits to, that all parties really know what we're committing to, without actually revealing it? So this is sort of the topic today. And this problem was tackled in cryptography. Maybe the first instance that many of you are familiar with is zero-knowledge proofs of knowledge. So in a proof of knowledge, what we require is that if a prover manages to prove an NP statement to a verifier, then it must mean that he knows the witness. Now, where's the challenge? The challenge is that this is a zero-knowledge proof. So in particular, it's supposed to somehow hide the witness. It cannot just send this witness in the clear and then reveal this knowledge. So this is what the challenge is and what makes this non-trivial. And the way that you formalize this knowledge of saying that the prover actually knows a witness is by requiring that there is an efficient extractor algorithm that can look at the prover and then somehow extract this witness. And this paradigm of extraction really became to be the main way that we formalize what is knowledge in a computational sense, particularly in cryptography. So knowledge is what we can actually efficiently extract from an algorithm, from an adversarial algorithm. And it's a goal on its own, but it's also very useful in analysis when we analyze our protocols. It is very often used by security reductions or by simulators. And there are really a lot of examples. For example, in zero-knowledge simulators, often the simulator tries to extract the trapdoor from the verifier. In keeping inputs independence in multi-party computation, we want to know that parties really know what is their input that they're committing to and not choosing it depending on other parties' inputs. It's really quite essential in cryptographic analysis. I'm sure you've all encountered extraction, at least to some level. Okay, so what is the next question we need to address here is how really do we extract knowledge? How does this occur? How does such an extraction algorithm look like? And the common answer that in most cryptographic application, this extraction is a completely black box procedure, meaning that the extractor doesn't really care about the actual code of the algorithm. It interacts with this algorithm in a black box way. And there are several techniques for doing that in the interactive setting. This usually involves certain rewinding, so it feeds it different messages, view the behavior. There are other paradigms. For example, if we have certain public parameters like public keys, perhaps in the system, then maybe the extractor could generate fake public keys and have some trapdoor that will allow it to extract. There are different ways of doing that. So this is black box extraction, and this is really most of cryptography. But there are exceptions to this. Okay, so black box extraction, and more generally, if you think about black box security reductions or simulators, have limitations. We know that there are certain things that you cannot hope to do with black box reductions or simulators. Some famous examples come from zero-knowledge protocols like constant round public coin protocols. Another thing that we'll discuss today is succinct arguments, succinct non-interactive arguments. So what do we do? So you may also know that we do have certain non-black box techniques. Okay, at the time this was a big surprise. This was very surprising, but it's been over a decade now, even a decade and a half, since Barak introduced non-black box techniques that show that sometimes you can actually use the adversary code in your reductions. In particular, if you're extracting something, maybe you can use this code to actually do something meaningful. But these non-black box techniques sort of have their own barriers. They hit a wall. And this wall is really related to interaction. So when you look at the non-black box techniques that we have, that really come, their origin is at this technique of Barak, then they require at least a minimal amount of interaction. You really need interaction in order to actually extract or to make useful, to make this knowledge that you extract useful. And in the non-interactive setting, we seem to need stronger non-black box techniques. In particular, something like succinct non-interactive arguments is not something that we know how to do from the non-black box techniques that we have. Okay, so this brings me to the next part of the story, where we're going to talk about knowledge assumptions, in particular Damgard's knowledge of exponent assumption, and extractable functions, and we'll see how they may help us solve this problem. Okay. Questions? So what is the knowledge of exponent assumption? I imagine that many of you have seen it. Here we have the following. So we have a group, like think about it as a discrete log group of order p. And what we're going to do is we have some adversary, and we sample a two-dimensional vector v. We encode it in the exponent in this group. Think there's some public generator, and we give this to the adversary. Okay, now what does the adversary try to do? He tries to output an encoding of another vector in the span of this first vector, in its linear span. Okay. Now, of course, this is easy to do. We've all worked with discrete log groups. You simply, you choose some scalar alpha. You raise this thing to the power of alpha, and you get something in the span. Okay. So the idea behind the knowledge of exponent assumption is to say that basically this is the only way that you can do this. Meaning that if the adversary manages to output something in the span of this vector, okay, in the exponent, then it must mean that it knows this scalar alpha. There's no other way of doing this. And even if there is, we could somehow extract this alpha. So this is really captured by this notion of an extractor. What we would like to say is that there exists an extractor that will output this alpha. Okay. So just to repeat, what does the assumption says? It says that any adversary has such an extractor, so that when the adversary gets this encoded vector and outputs something in the span, an encoding in the span, then the extractor, given the same input, can output the secret scalar alpha. Okay? It really sort of can figure out from its code what is the secret exponent alpha. Okay? Now, of course, this notion is really meaningful only if we assume that discrete logs are hard. If in particular the extractor can take discrete logs, then finding out what is alpha is really easy. This entire thing is really meaningful, assuming discrete log, and this is also why this has to be non-black box. Okay, the extractor cannot just look at whatever the adversary output, that's this g to the alpha times the vector, because it cannot solve discrete logs. Okay, and this is really when extraction becomes meaningful, when it's coupled with some sort of hardness or privacy. Okay. Yeah.
This seems to be false. Should he output g to the alpha together with g to the alpha d?
What?
Well, if he outputs only g, why can't he just output a random group element without knowing anything?
The v is a vector.
Oh, it's a vector. Sorry.
V is a vector. That's a good point. You're right. Right. More questions? Good. So this is the knowledge of exponent assumption, and you can actually abstract it, and you can talk about the general concept of extractable functions, where the adversary perhaps gets as input a certain key that you sample from a family, and he tries to output something in the image of this function. Okay? And what we'd like to say is that if he manages to do so, it must know the preimage. Okay, the only way you can do this is by actually choosing a preimage, applying the function, etc. There will be a non-black box extractor that will be able to obtain a preimage. And again, this is meaningful once you couple it with some form of hardness. It could be just one-way functions. The case of knowledge of exponent corresponds to one-way functions. You can easily generalize knowledge of exponent to talk about collision-resistant hash functions, and we'll see other sort of extractable primitives later on today. Okay, now let me say already that there are other more elaborate notions of extraction. There are many different bits here. And I'm not going to touch all of them today. I'm going to stick with the simple examples of knowledge of exponent and these simple extractable functions. Okay. So let's move to talk a bit about applications, on why do we really want these extractable functions. I told you that the non-black box techniques that we have hit a certain barrier. How do these guys help us? Let's see what we can do with them. Let me give you sort of an historical account of how such knowledge assumptions were used. Okay, and it's not that many things. You'll see soon. So the first application and sort of the reason that Damgard originally introduced this assumption was in order to achieve CCA security for encryption. So by now we know how to do this without knowledge assumption, of course. The next sort of application was this long-standing classical problem in zero knowledge, which is constructing zero knowledge proofs or even arguments with free messages. Okay, so this was constructed directly from the knowledge of exponent assumptions. And then later people figured out that you can sort of generalize this and you can abstract it and construct them from this more general notion of extractable one-way functions. The next application, and perhaps this is going to be the application, is these succinct non-interactive arguments, even succinct non-interactive arguments of knowledge. And I'm going to talk about them at length. And again, these were things that initially were constructed directly from knowledge of exponent, and later on we figured how to sort of abstract things out. By now we know how to construct them from more generic extractable primitives like extractable collision resistance or linear only encryption, which I will mention a bit later. And something nice about these abstractions is that you can actually also get them from different knowledge assumptions, not necessarily the knowledge of exponent assumptions, but knowledge assumptions that seem to be related to homomorphic encryptions. It can come from other areas like factoring or lattices. Okay, so I already told you that CCA is something that we already know how to do, that is something that you all know. And actually in very recent work, we've also figured out how to do free message zero knowledge from simple assumptions without knowledge assumptions. So at this point, it really seems that sort of the main application of this object, of this concept of extractable functions, and knowledge assumptions is really succinct arguments. Perhaps we should sort of modify our picture. But what I want to say is that these SNARKs, which we're going to talk about, are actually quite powerful. It seems to be a worthy application. So let me tell you a little bit about it.
Sorry, I missed.
Yes.
Sorry, I missed on the previous slide. You're saying that the one before.
Right.
So you're saying you don't need. Sorry, I missed the point. You don't need knowledge of exponent for anything except for SNARKs.
At this point, yeah.
I see, but linear encryption is not a knowledge assumption.
It is definitely a knowledge assumption. So this is still in the regime of knowledge assumption. The question is, do we still need them? Do we really need them? Or can we always sort of develop explicit non-black box techniques to handle these challenges? Right, you can relax things. I will touch this later, but it's still, I think, a similar flavor of having like a non-explicit, like an implicit object. But we'll touch this in a second. Yes. So this is like really a new work with Omer and Yael that we've recently posted on ePrint. which does arbitrary non-uniform adversaries. And the assumption is it's basically a new assumption, but it's a simple one. It's related to collision resistance. It's called multi-collision resistance. I can tell you a little bit about it later if you like. Okay. More questions?
So sometimes like people do proofs in the generic.
In the generic model, right.
For example, some of the signature schemes.
Mm-hmm.
Generic ones.
Right.
That's also a knowledge assumption.
You're absolutely right. So generically, the knowledge of exponent assumption is correct. If all that you can do is, basically raise group elements to scalars and then, add them together, then yes, the knowledge assumption in this model is correct. The question is what happens in reality, in the plane model. Okay. More? Okay, so let's discuss SNARKs a little bit, and first let me tell you why I think it is a worthy application. So apparently we can do a quite impressive things from SNARKs, starting from the first thing you would think about, the classical application to delegation of computation, but also many other interesting things, both of theoretical importance, but perhaps I think like something that's very impressive about SNARKs is that they were actually implemented and were actually used. There's been a lot of work. I don't have here room for all the citations on the impressive implementation work that's been done here, and they seem to be very very useful in practice. In particular, you may know that SNARKs are sort of the backbone of this now rising cryptocurrency, Zcash. Eran can tell you more about it. So people really are sort of putting their money on this thing. So now more than ever, there's actually I think money on the knowledge of exponent assumptions in some sense. So SNARKs really seem to be quite a killer application, and at least at the moment, knowledge assumptions or something in that area seems to be required. So let me tell you a little more about what are these SNARKs in case you haven't met them. So SNARK stands for succinct non-interactive argument of knowledge. Okay, and what this thing is basically is it's a proof system. Okay, and in what sense is it non-interactive? So the verifier can send a message, but it's a set of messages. It's fixed once and for all. You can view it as a common reference string, if you'd like, and then you can reuse it for multiple instances and proof. And then the proof is just a single message, and the point is that we want these proofs to be very short and easy to verify. Okay? So in particular, you can verify NP statements much faster than the actual NP verification time. Okay? It should be independent of the actual NP verification time. So this is their functionality and efficiency. In terms of soundness, what do you want? So since these proofs are succinct, you have to compromise for computational soundness, unless strange things happen in the complexity world, hierarchy collapses, etc. And here we're actually going to require more, and I'll come back to this distinction again later on. So the fact that there's SNARKs with a K of knowledge means that it's not only that we want them to be sound, but we also want this extra extraction guarantee. Okay? So if the prover successfully convinces the verifier, we'd like to say that there's an extractor, a non-black box extractor, that can come up with a corresponding witness. Okay. Now, let me say that there are many variants to this notion with different parameters. For example, is the common random string long or short? And can you publicly or privately verify them? I'm not going to go into these in details today. But I do want to sort of give you a sense of how you can construct these guys based on knowledge assumptions, and also where is knowledge really important. So I'm going to describe a generic approach, and it's going to be a really oversimplified description. I'm just going to give you sort of the high level idea. It's also going to sort of achieve the weakest variant, where sort of this common random string is going to be very long, but the proofs are going to be very short and fast and easy to verify. It's also going to be privately verifiable and not publicly verifiable, but it's going to be very simple. And then this approach follows a pretty common paradigm when designing in cryptographic protocols and in proofs in particular, which is we start with an information theoretic object, okay, in some restricted model that it's not the realistic model, and then we use crypto in order to enforce this model. Okay, and this is something very common. If you know, for example, of Kilian's interactive succinct argument, this is exactly how it works. You take an information theoretic object like PCPs, you use hashing in order to turn it into an actual real-world protocol. Okay, so what are these things? So a linear PCP is basically the following. So like in a PCP, the prover that has the witness can generate this proof string, only that we're not just going to think about it as a string, we're actually going to think about this as a vector, okay, in some appropriate field. So the prover writes this vector in the sky, and then he goes away. And now, like in the PCP model, the verifier can ask a question, only that the question is also a vector. Okay, so it's a vector of the same dimension. And the way that the answer looks like is just applying the proof as a linear function. Okay, so it's basically the inner product of the proof and the verifier's query. Okay, so the answer to this is conceptually short. It's a single field element. Okay, but maybe the question itself, the vector could be much longer. And for the sake of this talk, you can think about one query. You might want to think in general about more, but you could, for the sake of this talk, let's think about one query. And this is something that I'm going to say as a fact, is that we in fact have very efficient such linear PCPs. They seem to be much easier to construct than the standard model PCPs. In particular, you can get them from the Hadamard PCP. There are other simple constructions, but they're not only simple, they also have very efficient implementation related to quadratic span programs, where really the prover is very efficient, basically runs at the same time as the computation, but also the verifier is not only efficient, it's also very simple. It basically takes an inner product or something of that sort. So these guys are quite appealing, and we want to use them. And to do this, we're going to use crypto, and we're going to use an extractable primitive, okay, a knowledge primitive that is called linear-only encryption. And here the idea is the following. Okay, so you have a linearly homomorphic encryption scheme. Okay, so if you have encrypted field elements, you can perform linear operations over these elements. but you would like to say, and semantically secure in some sense, but you'd like to say the following. You'd like to say that if the adversary can take your encryptions and then somehow form from them a new encryption that is valid in some sense, okay, it passes some test, then it must know a corresponding linear operation, okay? Again, what we want to say is that there's an extractor that can extract a corresponding vector so that if you look at the result of decryption, then it's really the result of applying this vector to these elements, simply a linear function, okay? And there are candidates for such linear only encryption schemes. You can take various linear encryption schemes that we have and tweak them a little bit and make a corresponding knowledge assumption in the style of the knowledge of exponent assumption. You can also get things that are very similar from the knowledge of exponent assumption itself. I'm not going to get into that. Now, once you have these two primitives, it's pretty clear now how to combine them. The idea is that this linear-only encryption exactly forces the information theoretic model that we wanted, the fact that the prover is linear, so you can devise the following SNARK, where the verifier would simply first sample the PCP, the linear PCP query, this vector. It would encrypt using the linear-only encryption the queries and send them over to the prover. And the prover on his side would now generate the PCP, the linear PCP vector, apply the homomorphism, and return the result. Okay. Now, what's the intuition regarding the soundness here? Why is this thing sound? So what we know is that whenever the verifier accepts, then by the linear-only property of this encryption scheme, we know that the extractor can extract a corresponding vector, okay? So that if you actually look at what the verifier decrypts, it's simply applying this vector to the result, okay? And the point is the following. We know that furthermore, this result is a valid PCP answer for the linear PCP because the verifier accepts. And the claim is that this proof, the extracted proof, should be not only locally satisfying for whatever queries were encrypted, but also globally satisfying. Also must satisfy with high probability a random query. And the reason here is semantic security. This is where knowledge and privacy come together. The point is that the extractor that outputs this proof in the clear cannot violate the semantic security of the encryption. It can't really tell the specific random query from a completely independent random query. Now, this is soundness. These actual, the actual properties of these PCPs are stronger. And once you have such a highly satisfying proof, you can also decode the witness from this. So you get the witness that you want. You really get extraction. Okay, so I want to go back to what Yuval asked before. So we've seen a simple construction of SNARKs, and I've used a knowledge assumption to actually get it, and accordingly we get we also get a succinct argument of knowledge. You can also extract, and you can ask whether knowledge was really crucial here. And the first answer would be that not necessarily. Okay, so in particular, if you're only interested in soundness, you can formulate a weaker linear-only property where the extractor is sort of inefficient. It's not exactly an extraction definition, it's more of a simulation definition, but it still has the same flavor in the sense that it's implicit. We sort of assume that that exists. But more than that, I would like to say that knowledge does turn out to be crucial when you actually look at the applications of SNARKs, and in particular when you compose them with anything else. So for example, if you look at Zcash or at other applications, and you're basically going to use SNARKs in order to prove statements of the form, I know the preimage of a certain hash function, a shrinking hash function. And here, of course, that mere soundness is meaningless. There always exists a preimage. Okay? To actually say that this is meaningful, that you can find collisions in the hash function, etc., we really need knowledge. We really need to say that you can efficiently find this preimage. And this is not only when composing SNARKs with other primitives, it's also when composing SNARKs with themselves. So once you actually have this extraction guarantee, something quite powerful that you can do is recursively compose SNARKs to sort of prove the validity of evolving computation. This is the idea of proof-carrying data by Chiesa and Trommel. So for example, you can prove that not only you know the preimage, but you also verified a previous SNARK of the previous preimage. And this way you can sort of recursively extract. And this is quite powerful. In particular, what it lets you do is you can take SNARKs that are not that ideal. In particular, we have this very long common random string, and maybe the prover efficiency is not that great, and you can bootstrap them to sort of optimal, at least asymptotically optimal SNARKs using this repeated extraction property. Okay. So this is what I wanted to tell you about SNARKs, just as demonstration of the power of knowledge, and I think the SNARKs themselves are quite worthy of this. And then let's still think and ask ourselves, and go back to the question that perhaps this talk started with, which is, so why don't we like these knowledge assumptions? Why do we consider them that non-standard? After all, they have candidates that existed for almost 30 years and haven't been broken. There seems to be intuition behind these candidates. In particular, I think that the knowledge of exponents is really based on what we know how to do with these discrete log groups. Okay, it will be very surprising if we can obliviously sample such images. It has great applications. So but what's missing? Okay, what are we unhappy about? So let's try to pinpoint the problem and say why. In case I'll tell you why I don't like them that much, and I quite like them, and still. So the point is that knowledge assumptions can be viewed in some sense as a whole in our security reduction. So for example, if we mentioned the Zcash application, now we have someone that somehow managed to break it, and we want to use this somewhere in order to derive collisions in SHA, then okay, we have our reduction, and the reduction uses the extractor given by the knowledge of exponent assumption, but the problem is that it's not really there. Okay, we don't have this algorithm in our hands. We don't know how to write its code and actually extract collisions in SHA. This algorithm is implicitly assumed to exist. Okay, so this is very unsatisfying, and you should ask, what does really hope to get around this? Okay, is there any hope of actually coming up with extractable function, something with that power that has explicit extractors that you can actually write your code. Let me say a bit more precisely what I mean here. So when we say explicit, what we usually mean is basically that we sort of switch the order of quantifiers here, and rather than saying that there just exists an extractor, we basically want to say that there's a code like that we can write down, an explicit code, some universal extractor, okay, that given as input, the code of the adversary would be able to efficiently extract the corresponding knowledge. Okay, so this would be explicit extraction. And when I talk about the non-black box techniques that we have, for example, those that come from Barak, they are explicit. They're the non-black box zero-knowledge simulator is an algorithm that you can actually write down. And this algorithm takes whatever code is given as input and manages to simulate. So it would be fantastic if we can get this and from any simple and standard assumptions, but there does seem to be a limitation here. Okay, and the limitation is the following. The limitation is that reverse engineering is generally hard. It could be computationally hard. In particular, when you think about the code of the adversary, it may very well be obfuscated. It may be very hard to actually figure out from its code how the adversary derives the image. For example, it could maybe have like an obfuscated pseudorandom function in its inside. It first applies it, you don't know how, and then it outputs the corresponding image. If this obfuscation is equivalent to a black box, there's no way you're going to figure this out. And this is something that you can actually formalize, even using the weakest meaningful obfuscation definition that we have, even assuming indistinguishability obfuscation. You cannot have such universal simulators in the general case. So it somewhat seems that this whole is here to stay, and we're just going to have to live with it. But I do want to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes of the talk in giving you some things to think about. I don't think it's really all done. So let me tell you a little bit about open problems or possible directions. Okay. So here's one thing that we know how to do with an explicit extractor from standard assumptions. We can come up with extractable functions, extractable one-way functions specifically, in the case that the adversary has a very short description. In particular, it's uniform. Think that it has a constant size code, basically. Okay. So in this case, we can actually do this, and this is sufficient for example, free message zero knowledge against the corresponding class of verifiers. So, this is not great, but it's already something. It's one thing in this direction, but we only know to do this for one-way functions. Can you do this for anything beyond that? In particular, can you do this for collision-resistant hash functions? The construction that we have seems inherently not collision-resistant. And if you could you leverage that to actually achieve SNARKs against the corresponding notion of adversaries that have bounded non-uniformity? Question?
Can you extract the same x that is inside it, or can you extract x prime such that fk of x prime is equal to fk of x?
You extract x prime. Yeah, that's why the collision resistance will never work. Good. So another thing about this is that, okay, so seems like a good direction, but it is very unsatisfying. And in particular, I think a serious caveat of this construction is that it's somewhat unrealistic in the sense that the function that you actually construct, if you look at its input size, then it's really, it's bigger than the whatever algorithm you're trying to extract from. Okay, so we're assuming that the algorithm has constant size or some bounded size, and the input to the function could be much larger. We're not bounding the running time, okay, so it can still compute this function, can run in arbitrary polynomial time, but still its description is very small, and this seems somewhat unrealistic. Can we do something in the general setting for adversaries of arbitrary size, with arbitrary non-uniformity? And one thing that you can try to do is, for example, you can try to relax this definition. So here's a definition that may seem very natural. In particular, we could ask that, usually when the adversary succeeds for a random key, the extractor needs to succeed for the same key. What if we allow the extractor sort of interpolate between techniques that we have in the black box regime, where the extractor gets to have certain trapdoors? What if we let the extractor, for example, simulate the key to something that is indistinguishable from a real key, and say that in this case it manages to extract? So this still seems to be a quite strong definition. In particular, I think that you can do from this free message zero knowledge. But as far as I know, it's not sufficient for the other great applications like SNARKs, for example. So the question here is whether you can really come up with ways of using such a relaxed definition. Oh, and let me mention that the impossibilities that we have really sort of fail here. And the reason is that in this setting, the extractor really gets to generate a key that is correlated to the adversary's code. It's not independent of its code. It's not like an obfuscation. It was independently generated. So here, here's the wiggle room. Yeah, so show that this is sufficient. Try to construct this. Could be interesting. The last thing, or just one before the last, that I would like to say, goes back to the non-uniform definition. Yes.
I'm a little confused.
Mm-hmm.
Last night, why can't, like with trapdoor permutations or something, why can't just the extractor generate a key for which he knows a trapdoor and can extract next? Or maybe I missed it, but you're supposed to generate a K tilde that's.
So I want this key to be public. Yeah.
But the extractor is allowed to generate his own.
Sorry. I want this also to be hard. So, for example, to actually use this for zero.
Trapdoor permutation.
Okay, that's a great point. You have to be much more careful here. As its own, this doesn't seem strong enough. In particular, saying use trapdoor permutations. The extractor has the trapdoor for the permutation. You use this. This won't be sufficient in applications. There should have been an extra line here that says we need stronger one witness here. So for example, to get free message zero knowledge from this sort of concept, what you would need is one witness for each and every key, for a worst case choice of the key. And this is something that trapdoor permutations won't give you. Yeah. So this is a definition that haven't really been explored too thoroughly. There's things to think about here. Okay. Yeah, so the last thing I want to say is, let's go back to the non-uniform setting of, perhaps having an extractor that is not explicit, meaning that you fix the code of the adversary, then you get to go home, spend as much time as you want de-obfuscating it, analyzing it, coming up with an extractor. Okay, it's still a meaningful definition, even if it's not that great. Can we do something that is really beyond assuming? Okay, and under what kind of assumption? How can we really seems to be related to how much we understand non-uniformity and the power of non-uniformity. What can you do? I have no idea. I don't think I think this could be possible. Or alternatively, disprove this, again, using corresponding non-uniform techniques. Try to disprove this. Try to come up with an attack, with a non-uniform attack that would show that even extractable functions according to this sense are somewhat impossible. And you have great motivation to do this now. If you break knowledge of exponent, or in particular break Zcash, there seems to be a lot of money for you in it. I wouldn't encourage new grad students to try and do this, but we should keep an open mind.
Would or wouldn't?
I wouldn't.
Why not?
Well, I think it's true. I have no good reason to. What?
How would you make money out of breaking the zero knowledge property?
That's a good point. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yes.
What about the I/O?
Yeah.
What happens when you apply an obfuscation
To who? To what?
to the program for which you want to extract?
Right. Okay. So this is what I mentioned before. This is really a barrier to explicit extraction. If we want our extractor to be, an algorithm that you can write ahead of time, okay, and then it gets an arbitrary code, possibly I/O obfuscated code, then basically you're screwed. You won't be able to do this, and you can actually formalize this. You can prove this based on I/O. So your only hope is really to have this implicit definition that says, okay, so maybe I cannot reverse engineer this adversary online efficiently, but I can go home, I can de-obfuscate its code, whatever secrets there are there, I'm going to extract them using infinite power, and this is often sufficient for our reductions in many cases. And this is the only knowledge of assumption variant that still stands.
What does going home mean?
Yeah, it means it means that your extractor can be an arbitrary polynomial size circuit. So your only limitation is that at the end of the day, at the end of this operation, you get to keep a small circuit, a small extractor circuit. Okay.
Again, a more serious version of my previous question about Zcash. So there is a big gap between breaking the underlying assumption that we like and breaking, say, the soundness of the argument system, right? So what can you say about this gap?
Again, sorry.
There's a big gap between invalidating the knowledge assumption on which, say, soundness relies,
Mm-hmm.
and actually breaking the soundness, right? So if you disprove the knowledge assumption, say, of which SNARKs, forget about the knowledge aspect, just soundness.
You're right. It doesn't necessarily.
Breaking the actual soundness, right?
You're right. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can make money this fast. Perhaps you need to really go an extra mile and also break the soundness. Also, then it's not always.
But then the question is that maybe you have a much more relaxed sufficient condition, certainly if you only care about soundness, which doesn't talk at all about knowledge.
Right, but we don't know how to prove things from this notion, right? Like in particular, using only soundness in Zcash to prove there exists a pre-image to this, shrinking hash function is not meaningful. I'm done. So more questions?
So,
Yeah.
You said, personally I think that if someone would be able to break the knowledge of exponent in some meaningful way, would be the most important result about the cryptanalysis of public key cryptography since 2000 years ago.
Maybe, yeah.
So I think.
Or maybe it's going to take advantage of some, I don't know, maybe it's going to use a certain non-uniform assumption that is natural and won't imply anything for actually, obliviously sampling. It won't imply an efficient algorithm to obliviously sample such encoded vectors. It's not that clear, I think. Well, that
That
was a
actually
glitch.
It's a
Yeah.
formalistic thing.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
Yeah,
no
maybe,
real,
maybe now too, the way things are formulated are, maybe there is a break which is not fundamental. That's it.
Yeah, that could definitely be. Okay, so thanks.